The courtroom was silent except for the shuffle of papers. On one side sat a row of men who had spent decades alone in windowless cells at Pelican Bay State Prison's SHU. Their wrists and ankles were chained, yet their eyes held steady as the judge prepared to read a ruling that could change California's prison system forever. Lawyers whispered about how many years these prisoners had been in solitary, some over 20. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing history. The lead plaintiff, Todd Ashker, lifted his hand slightly, as if holding the weight of all the voices still locked inside. The state's attorney adjusted his tie, glancing at the spectators, while a group of former guards stood at the back, curious but wary. For years, California's officials had argued that indefinite isolation in the SHU was necessary to control prison gangs. But now the policy itself was on trial. The judge's voice echoed, "This court recognizes the constitutional challenge." Then she paused, scanning the packed room. Cameras clicked. It felt like the entire system had stopped breathing for a second. Ashker and the other plaintiffs had claimed that long-term solitary confinement amounted to cruel and unusual punishment, violating the Eighth Amendment. Their lawsuit, Ashker vs. Governor, filed in 2012 with support from the Center for Constitutional Rights, argued that gang validation and indefinite isolation were used far beyond what was necessary for safety. As the judge began to outline the state's defense, the scene shifted in Ashker's mind back to Pelican Bay's SHU. He pictured his 8 by 10-foot cell, no windows, concrete walls, meals through a slot, and only an hour a day alone in a small pen. He remembered the endless years of tapping codes to other men through vents just to keep from losing his mind. He remembered the hunger strikes that had drawn headlines, when thousands of inmates refused food to protest indefinite isolation. The lawyers had brought photos of those cells into court, the heavy doors with no bars, the tiny dog-run yards, the stacks of documents where names were linked to gangs without hearings. They had lined the courtroom walls with exhibits showing decades of confinement and studies about psychological harm. The public saw, maybe for the first time, what the word Supermax really meant. A correctional officer who once worked the SHU sat at the back, recalling the eerie quiet of the tier broken only by the sound of slot doors and coded knocks. He had testified about the mental toll on staff too, how working in near silence for years changed your sleep and your patience. He wondered if this case would finally force a different approach. The judge turned another page. "The settlement terms," she said, but then stopped, whispering to a clerk. The room stirred. Someone outside the courtroom shouted and the sound bled faintly through the door. For a moment no one knew if the ruling was about to be read, or delayed. Ashker gripped the table. In his mind, the decades of solitary, the hunger strikes, the letters smuggled to lawyers, all balanced on this second. The attorneys exchanged glances, one of them mouthing, "Is it happening now?" The judge looked up. "Before I proceed," she said, "I must address new information submitted this morning." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters raised their pens. Guards at the back stepped closer, and just like that, the decision that could end indefinite solitary confinement in California hung in the air, suspended, as the courtroom waited to learn what would happen next. The judge's voice broke the tension. "This court has reviewed the settlement agreement reached between the parties." A low murmur rolled across the room. The plaintiffs sat a little straighter. After 3 years of filings, hearings, and hunger strikes, they were about to hear if California would finally end indefinite SHU terms. On a projection screen, the clerk displayed key points. Gang validation alone would no longer mean permanent solitary. Inmates held for decades in the SHU would be moved back to general population unless there was a clear, current threat. A new step-down program would be created. The judge read each line carefully. "This settlement is approved." Todd Ashker closed his eyes. He had entered the SHU in the late 1980s, believing he might die there. Now, after the 2015 settlement, thousands of men like him were scheduled for review and transfer. News outlets rushed to file stories. A guard in the back whispered to another, "This is going to change everything." Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around attorneys and family members. One mother clutched a photo of her son who had been in solitary for 15 years and said, "This gives me hope." The lead lawyer explained that the settlement didn't abolish solitary confinement entirely but sharply limited its use and forced regular reviews. No more decades in a windowless cell without a clear reason, she said. Meanwhile, inside Pelican Bay, staff prepared for the changes. The SHU corridors echoed with unusual activity as case files were reviewed. Some inmates who had tapped on pipes for years now spoke face-to-face in small group programs. Others were skeptical, worried that rival gang members would be waiting. Correctional officers held briefings on new policies. One officer admitted in a public meeting that the SHU had been a blunt instrument. "We needed control," he said, "but the toll was heavy, on them and on us." Oversight teams from Sacramento toured the prison to make sure the settlement was being implemented, yet the transition wasn't smooth. Violence flared in a few yards as old rivalries surfaced. Some prisoners who had been in isolation for decades struggled to adjust to group settings. "It's like stepping onto another planet," one man said in an interview. Mental health staff increased their presence to help with the shock. At the same time, legislators in Sacramento debated bills to codify limits on solitary confinement statewide. Advocates hailed the Pelican Bay settlement as a turning point. "This case shows that even the most entrenched systems can change," said one senator. Back in his cell, Ashker wrote a letter to supporters. "The fight isn't over," he wrote. "But today we showed that voices from behind these walls can be heard." He slipped the letter into an envelope addressed to a civil rights group. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. Late that evening, a guard walking the tier noticed several cell doors propped open for movement reviews, something that had not happened in years. The air felt different. As the officer reached the end of the hallway, he saw a cluster of inmates standing silently in their small pens, staring at the sky through a narrow grate, unsure if freedom from isolation would really come. The lights flickered. An announcement crackled over the loudspeaker: "Unit transfer scheduled for morning." Cheers rose from a few cells, others stayed quiet. Change had begun,